Just another political appointee, here to get in the way and tick a box. Ma'am, if you wouldn't mind, the coffee station is over there. Try not to spill anything on the $1,000,000 consoles. The words, slick with condescension, were delivered by Commander Alex Jensen, his chest puffed out like a powder pigeon in his crisp Navy working uniform. He didn't even grant the woman the courtesy of a full glance, his eyes already flicking back to the shimmering holographic command table that dominated the center of the Fleet Command Simulation Center. The junior officers and enlisted technicians arrayed around the tiered, circular room exchanged nervous, knowing glances. A few offered weak, complicit smiles. They knew the commander's temper, his abrasive pride, his utter intolerance for anyone he deemed an outsider. The woman, dressed in simple gray slacks and a plain blue blouse that made her look more like a university librarian than a guest in the heart of naval wargaming, gave no reaction. She was of average height, with a frame that seemed almost lost in the cavernous, dimly lit chamber. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, severe bun, revealing a face that was unadorned by makeup and marked by a quiet intensity rather than conventional beauty. She didn't flinch. She didn't retort. She didn't even seem to register the insult. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on the three-dimensional star chart, where constellations of blue icons representing their fleet were poised against a swarm of red aggressors. As Jensen turned, gesturing expansively to make a point to his tactical officer, his elbow swung back carelessly, catching the woman squarely on the cheek. It wasn't a malicious blow, but it was delivered with the same dismissive force as his words, the physical punctuation to his verbal contempt. A soft gasp rippled through the back row technicians. The woman's head snapped to the side from the impact, a faint red mark already blooming on her skin. For a heartbeat, the entire room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation, the angry protest. But there was nothing. She simply straightened up, her hand rising not to her cheek, but to adjust the fall of her simple blouse, a gesture of resetting, of composure. Her eyes, a clear and piercing gray, never left the holographic display. It was this silence, this profound and unnervous calm in the face of public humiliation, that was more unsettling than any shout could have ever been. High in the darkened observation deck that ringed the top of the center, Fleet Admiral Marcus Thorne leaned forward in his chair, his old eyes narrowing. He had seen that stance before, that unnatural stillness under pressure. It was the hallmark of a very specific, very rare kind of warrior. He didn't know who this woman was, but he knew with bone-deep certainty that Commander Jensen had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his career. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of your voice, but in the precision of your actions, type competence below. The air in the simulation center was thick with the scent of ozone and recycled air, a sterile environment designed for the cold calculus of war. The only sounds were the low, constant hum of the servers that powered the vast holographic display and the clipped, professional jargon of the bridge crew as they ran through pre-engagement checklists. Commander Jensen paced the command ring like a caged predator, his voice a sharp bark that cut through the low thrum of the machinery. Report, tactical, sir. Red Fleet is holding position just outside the asteroid belt, Scylla 9. They're running sensor ghosts, trying to mask their numbers. We estimate their strength at 3 carrier groups with destroyer and cruiser support, replied a young lieutenant, his eyes glued to his console. They're trying to draw us in, Jensen scoffed, a smirk playing on his lips. Amateur hour. They think we'll chase shadows into a kill box. We're not falling for it. Helm, bring carrier group Alpha to a new heading, 030, Mark II. Let's flank them. We'll use the belt's magnetic interference to mask our approach and hit their supply lines. He radiated a smug confidence, the kind of self-assurance that comes from acing every test and always knowing the textbook answer. His crew, accustomed to his arrogance, but also his record of success in these exercises, responded with crisp efficiency. The woman in civilian clothes had moved to the far wall, standing near a decommissioned server rack, a ghost at the edge of the room. She was utterly still, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. She seemed to be a statue, a silent observer to the grand theater of simulated naval combat. Her presence was an anomaly, an unsquared-away detail that irritated Jensen every time his gaze swept past her. He saw her as a bureaucratic parasite, a symbol of the civilian oversight he so deeply resented. The physical contact, the elbow, had been an accident born of his own theatrical movement, but his lack of apology was deliberate. It was a power play, a way to put the insignificant observer back in her place. He expected a complaint, a flustered retreat to the coffee station as he'd suggested. What he got was silence. A deep, unnerving silence that felt less like submission and more like judgment. He tried to ignore it, turning his focus back to the unfolding battle. But he could feel her gaze on the back of his neck, not hot with anger, but cool, analytical, and utterly unimpressed. The initial stages of the engagement went exactly as Jensen had predicted. His flanking maneuver caught the first wave of Red Fleet ships by surprise. Blue icons flared on the board as simulated missile locks were achieved, and red icons flickered and died. A wave of self-satisfied murmurs went through the crew. Jensen allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. This was his domain. He was the master of this digital ocean. The woman remained by the wall, her expression unchanged. She hadn't reacted to the initial insult, the physical blow, or the early success of the maneuver. It was as if she was watching a play for which she already knew the ending, and this first act was merely a tedious preamble to the inevitable tragedy. And in that cold, detached observation, a seed of doubt began to sprout in the back of even Jensen's supremely confident mind. He was playing checkers, and he was winning. But he had the sudden, chilling feeling that she was playing an entirely different game, on a board he couldn't even see. The tide of the battle turned with the suddenness of a lightning strike. As Jensen's carrier group Alpha cleared the asteroid belt, confident in their flanking position, the star chart erupted in a cascade of crimson alerts. Multiple new contacts. Sir, they're coming out of the belt. They weren't masking their fleet. They were masking the mines, the tactical officer shouted, his voice cracking with panic. On the holographic display, a dense, swirling cloud of red proximity icons materialized directly in the path of their fleet. Evasive maneuvers. All ships, hard to starboard. Full impulse. Jensen roared, his face draining of color. But it was too late. The textbook maneuver had led them into a textbook trap. Blue icons began to flash and extinguish in rapid succession, each one representing a multi-billion-dollar warship and its thousands of simulated crew members. The confident chatter of the command center devolved into a cacophony of damage reports and frantic, unanswered calls. The Intrepid is gone. The Valiant is venting plasma. We've lost the entire forward destroyer screen. The simulation was a no-win scenario, a Kobayashi Maru, designed by the Academy's most sadistic architects to test a commander's response to inevitable, catastrophic failure. Jensen was failing. He froze, his mind unable to process the sheer speed of his fleet's annihilation. His confidence shattered, leaving only raw, sputtering panic. Shut it down. Abort the simulation, he yelled, a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Sir, we can't. It's a command-level scenario. It has to play out, the system administrator replied, his face pale. The room was descending into chaos. And in the midst of it all, one person moved with purpose. The woman pushed off the wall. Her movements were not rushed, but they were possessed of an undeniable economy and precision. She walked directly toward the secondary command console, a redundant station that was rarely used. One of the junior officers, seeing her approach a restricted terminal, moved to intercept her. Ma'am, you can't be, he started, but he stopped as she passed him. There was an aura of authority about her, a silent, powerful gravity that brooked no argument. She didn't shove him aside. She simply occupied the space, and he yielded it as if by instinct. Her hands, which had been clasped calmly behind her back, now moved over the dormant console. They were steady, practiced, moving with a fluid certainty that was mesmerizing. She didn't look at the main holographic display. Her eyes were focused on a small, text-based diagnostic screen that the other officers had ignored. Her fingers danced across the keyboard, typing in lines of code that were long obsolete, command from a previous generation of operating systems. A series of manual override windows popped up on her screen, each one demanding a security clearance that no one in the room possessed. She entered them without hesitation. What is she doing? Jensen stammered, his authority completely gone. Now, just another panicked spectator. She's accessing the fleet's core systems directly, the administrator whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. Bypassing the command interface. No one does that. It's not even in the manual on the main display. The remaining blue icons stopped their frantic, doomed, evasive maneuvers. One by one, their engines went cold. Their tactical systems went dark. They went silent, drifting on pure momentum. It was the naval equivalent of a dead stick landing, a maneuver of last resort for a powerless aircraft. It was an act of surrender, a concession of the fight, but it was also an act of preservation. The proximity mines were triggered by active energy signatures, engines, weapons, shields. By going completely dark, the ships became inert hunks of metal, invisible to the minefield's triggers. She couldn't save them from the enemy fleet that would eventually arrive, but she had saved them from the immediate, total annihilation of the trap. With the fleet now drifting, she began a new sequence of commands. Her fingers tapped out complex calculations, plotting trajectories based not on engine power, but on the faint gravitational pull of the asteroids and the distant gas giant in the system. She was using celestial mechanics to nudge the dead fleet, inch by agonizing inch, through the narrow, safe corridors of the minefield she had somehow divined. The room fell into a profound, deafening silence. The frantic shouting was replaced by the soft, rhythmic clicking of the keyboard at her station. The crew watched, utterly mesmerized. They were witnessing something impossible, a feat of pure, unadulterated genius that defied all their training. It was like watching a grandmaster play 100 games of chess simultaneously, in their head, and win them all. The last ship, a carrier, its icon flickering with critical damage warnings, finally drifted clear of the red minefield cloud. A collective, unconscious sigh of relief swept through the room. She had taken a scenario designed for 100% destruction and salvaged over half the fleet. She had not won the battle, but she had defeated the simulation itself. The woman's hands fell still. She took one step back from the console, her work done. The red mark on her cheek was a stark contrast to the placid calm on her face. She looked at Jensen, her gray eyes holding his for the first time. There was no triumph in her gaze, no I told you, so there was only a quiet, devastating finality. The arrogance on his face had been replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. That's not possible, he whispered, the words barely audible. High in the observation deck, Admiral Thorne stood up, his knuckles white where he gripped the railing. A slow, knowing smile spread across his weathered face. I knew it, he breathed to his aide. Give me your file. Now, down on the command floor, the spell of silence was broken as Thorne's authoritative voice boomed over the intercom. Commander Jensen. Stand down. Jensen, startled, snapped to a semblance of attention, his face a mess of confusion and shame. All eyes turned toward the observation deck, where the imposing silhouette of the fleet admiral was now visible against the dim light. Thorne descended the spiral staircase to the command floor, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. He was a legend in the Navy, a man who had commanded carrier groups in 3 separate conflicts. His presence alone commanded absolute respect. He ignored Jensen completely. He walked directly to the woman, who stood calmly by the now-quiet console. He stopped 2 feet in front of her, his gaze sweeping over her simple civilian attire, the fading red mark on her cheek, and the profound stillness in her eyes. He saw not a librarian, but a weapon. His aide, a young captain, hurried to his side, holding out a data slate. Thorne took it, his eyes scanning the screen for only a moment before a look of immense, profound respect washed over his features. He looked from the slate back to the woman. Then, in a gesture that stunned every single person in the room, the 4-star fleet admiral, a man to whom presidents deferred on matters of war, drew himself up to his full height and executed the sharpest, most formal salute of his life. Admiral Hayes, he said, his voice ringing with an authority that left no room for doubt. My apologies for the state of this exercise. I was not aware you would be personally gracing us with your presence today, ma'am. The title hung in the air, electric and impossible. Admiral, not a liaison, not an aide, an admiral. Jensen's jaw literally dropped. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly white. He looked from his saluting fleet admiral to the small, quiet woman, and the entire world tilted on its axis. He hadn't just insulted a superior officer, he had struck one. He had dismissed and belittled a flag officer of the highest echelon. The aide, sensing the gravity of the moment, stepped forward and cleared his throat. He held up the data slate for the stunned command crew to see. The text on the screen was projected onto the main holographic display, replacing the star chart. It was a personnel file. The name read, Hayes, Evelyn. But it was the lines below that drew a collective, sharp intake of breath from everyone present. Rank, Admiral O10. Unit, Office of Naval Intelligence, Advanced Wargaming Directorate. A list of her accomplishments scrolled down the screen, a litany of legendary, almost mythical achievements. Designer, Project Kobayashi Maru 3, 4, and V. Architect of Operation Silent Talon, the strategy that had peacefully resolved the Orion standoff. Recipient of the Navy Cross, the Distinguished Service Medal with 3 gold stars. Her mission classifications were a string of blacked-out redactions, hinting at a career spent in the deepest, most sensitive echelons of national security. Her call sign, listed at the bottom, was the final, devastating blow. The architect, they had all heard the stories, the messed deck rumors of a ghost-like strategist who designed the Navy's most impossible tests, a commander so brilliant their very existence was treated as a state secret. They had assumed the architect was a grizzled old man, a veteran of a bygone era. They never imagined it was the quiet woman in the corner. Thorne lowered his salute, but his posture remained one of deep deference. Commander Jensen, he said, his voice now dangerously low, turning to the terrified officer. Admiral Hayes is the mind behind this simulation. She wrote the code for this no-win scenario when you were still in grade school. The dead stick gravitational navigation she just performed? That's not in any manual because she invented it. It's called the Hayes Maneuver, and it's classified above your pay grade. She wasn't observing the exercise, Commander. She was auditing it. And Thorne took a step closer to Jensen, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You failed. You failed the test of strategy. You failed the test of leadership. But most of all, you failed the test of character. You judged a book by its cover. And in doing so, you have brought shame upon yourself. In this command, he pointed a single, trembling finger at the fading mark on Admiral Hayes' cheek. And you dared to put your hands on her. The weight of that accusation settled over the room like a physical shroud. In the rigid hierarchy of the military, striking a superior officer was an almost unthinkable crime. Striking an admiral, a living legend, in a fit of arrogant carelessness. It was career suicide. Jensen could only stand there, mute and trembling, the architect of his own spectacular downfall. Admiral Hayes simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Thorne, a silent acknowledgement. Her work here was done. The lesson had been delivered. The story of what happened in the Fleet Command Simulation Center spread not like wildfire, but like a pressure wave from a deep-sea detonation, silent, powerful, and utterly transformative. It didn't travel through official channels or after-action reports, which were immediately classified at the highest level by Admiral Thorne. Instead, it moved through the whispered conversations in the barracks, the late-night chats in the mess halls, and the encrypted messages between officers across the fleet. The details were passed from the technicians who had witnessed it to their friends on the carriers, from the junior officers to their counterparts in the submarine service. The tale became an instant piece of naval folklore, a cautionary parable for the ages. Every telling added a thin new layer of myth. Some said Admiral Hayes had reprogrammed the entire simulation with her mind. Others claimed she had predicted the minefield trap by reading the subtle fluctuations in the room's power grid. The core facts, however, remained immutable. A loud, arrogant commander had dismissed and struck a quiet, unassuming woman, only to be publicly and devastatingly humbled when she was revealed to be the legendary admiral, the architect, who then saved his fleet with a move of impossible genius. Commander Jensen was not court-martialed. Admiral Hayes, in a final act of quiet instruction, had apparently requested leniency. Instead, his punishment was far more instructive. He was reassigned, not to a forgotten desk on a remote outpost, but to the Naval War College Library, where he was tasked with a special research project to declassify and write a doctrinal analysis of Admiral Hayes's tactical papers. It was a sentence of profound and humbling education. Day after day, Jensen sat in the silent, dust-moted archives, surrounded by the published works of the woman he had so casually assaulted. He read her treatises on asymmetrical warfare, her strategic forecasts, her piercing critiques of conventional naval doctrine. He discovered that her genius was not a parlor trick. It was the result of a lifetime of relentless study, discipline, and a deep, abiding humility. He saw, in her writings, the same quiet, methodical precision she had displayed at the console. He was being forced to confront the sheer, Everest-like scale of her competence, and in its shadow, his own arrogance seemed petty and insignificant. He began to change. His posture lost its aggressive edge. He spoke less and listened more. The other officers in the library, who had first avoided him, began to notice the shift. He would spend hours dissecting a single paragraph of Hayes's work, his face a mask of intense concentration. He wasn't just serving a sentence. He was becoming a student. The ripple effects extended far beyond Jensen. The junior officers and technicians who had been in the room that day were transformed. They had witnessed firsthand the stark difference between performative authority and true competence. The nervous, complicit laughter that had greeted Jensen's initial insult was now a source of collective shame. They learned that respect was not owed to the loudest voice in the room, but to the calmest mind. The term "pulling a Jensen" became shorthand on ships throughout the fleet for making a dangerously arrogant assumption. Conversely, a quiet, unassuming expert who suddenly revealed a stunning depth of skill was said to have gone full Hayes. The simulation center itself became a kind of hallowed ground. The secondary console that Admiral Hayes had used was cordoned off with a simple velvet rope. No one ordered it. The technicians just did it, out of a shared sense of reverence. Taped to the top of the monitor was a small, grainy security still from that day, showing a woman with a simple bun and steady hands, her face illuminated by the glow of the screen. Beneath it, someone had written a single word: precision. The story served as a powerful corrective to a culture that could sometimes prize swagger over substance. It reminded an entire generation of sailors and officers that the most dangerous weapon in the Navy's arsenal wasn't a hypersonic missile or a carrier group, but a quiet professional with a disciplined mind. The legend of the architect grew, but Admiral Evelyn Hayes herself remained a ghost. She never spoke of the incident. She returned to her shadowy work, designing the next generation of challenges that would forge the next generation of commanders. Her legacy was not in the story that was told about her, but in the lessons that were learned from it. It was a legacy of silence, of competence, and of the profound, unshakable power of demonstrated excellence. The humbled commander, the reverent crew, the hallowed console, they were all artifacts of her brief, impactful passage, monuments to the day that arrogance collided with genius and was utterly and deservedly broken. Years passed. The Hayes incident solidified its place in the annals of naval tradition, evolving from gossip into a formal case study taught at Annapolis and the Naval War College. It became a foundational lesson for every new class of ensigns and every aspiring commander. The story was used to illustrate the dangers of cognitive bias, the poison of arrogance, and the supreme virtue of professional humility. Commander Jensen, long since promoted to captain, became a surprisingly effective instructor at the War College. His lectures on tactical humility were legendary, delivered with the quiet conviction of a man who had learned his subject in the most painful way imaginable. He never mentioned the incident directly, but his students understood. The story was the ghost in the room, the unspoken context for every lesson he taught about leadership and respect. His personal file now contained a letter of commendation from Admiral Thorne, citing his extraordinary contributions to the advancement of naval strategic doctrine, a quiet redemption arc authored by the very system he had once disdained. The Hayes maneuver, once a classified secret known only to a few, was now standard procedure for navigating unexpected spatial anomalies or technologically sophisticated minefields. It had a new name in the official manuals, dynamic inertial coasting, but everyone in the fleet still called it by its true name. In a real-world crisis in the Epsilon Eridani system, a destroyer squadron, ambushed and crippled by a previously unknown alien weapon that targeted ship energy systems, found itself dead in the water and drifting toward a volatile nebula. The young squadron commander, a woman who had heard the story of the architect as a midshipman, remembered her lessons. Instead of panicking, she ordered her ships to go completely dark. Using the faint gravitational tides of the nebula itself, she navigated her dead squadron through the hazard, saving over 3,000 lives. The legend of Evelyn Hayes had passed from cautionary tale to life-saving doctrine. The final, and perhaps most profound, legacy of that day was not in the tactics or the technology, but in the culture. The quiet professional, once an archetype, became an ideal. The Navy began to actively seek out and promote officers who demonstrated not bluster and ambition, but calm, measured competence. The value of listening, of observing, of thinking before speaking was elevated. Admiral Hayes, now retired, never sought the spotlight. She lived quietly, her name unknown to the public she had so faithfully served. Her picture never appeared in the papers. Her medals were kept in a simple box in her study. Her satisfaction came not from accolades, but from a knowledge that her work continued, that the lessons she embodied were being passed down, creating a stronger, wiser, and more humble fleet. Her legacy wasn't a statue or a ship named in her honor. It was in the steady hands of a young ensign plotting a complex navigational solution. It was in the respectful silence a captain gave to a junior officer's innovative idea. It was in the thousands of sailors who understood that true strength wasn't about the rank on your collar or the volume of your voice, but about the relentless pursuit of excellence and the quiet dignity of a job well done. The real measure of a person is not found in the assumptions others make, but in the undeniable proof of their actions. It is a truth etched not in brass plaques, but in the character of those they inspire. Legacy is not what you leave behind in a file. It is what continues to move forward in the hearts and minds of others, a silent, powerful current guiding them toward a better version of themselves. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where professional respect defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.